Today we're going to be looking at food, a hugely important subject, everything from milk and bread to a Bakewell tart or even my favourite, a Scotch egg. Food's a really important part of everyday life, but how often when we reach up for the supermarket shelves do we actually think about where our food comes from, how it's produced and how much food we're using and wasting every single day? It's something that we're going to have to start thinking about a lot more, especially when you consider that 1/5 of the world's population live in China. So what people in China are eating and choosing to buy every day will have a huge impact on the global food system. And that's the topic we're going to get stuck into today with the help of two fantastic guests. And bearing in mind that that you've cooked in different countries around the world, probably eaten a lot of food in different countries over the globe. What's different in China?
That's a big question, and there's a number of things that are very different in China. But I think before you go into speaking about what are these specific differences in China, it's quite important to take a step back and realize or at least reiterate some of the things that we don't really say all that often. When it comes to a limitation in China, there's one thing that people often don't realize, and it's the speed at which things have changed in such a small period of time. Back in the 80s, China was among the world's most malnourished countries in the world. Over 300 million people were malnourished and lived under hunger. And as of last year, as of 2017, China just became the world's most obese nation. So in a period of no more than 40 years, China went from being the hungriest country on the planet to being the most obese country on the planet. And thinking about that is extremely important to understand the state of play of food in China today. If you take those shifts in the context of the life of one individual, and try to imagine the impact the implications that it has, that if you're 60 years old today in China, when you were growing up as a kid, your family probably didn't have enough food to eat, and now you're facing with extremely abundant selection of foods to eat, and that is one of the major differences that I see in China, and that have very strong implications in the food ecosystem.
And there's a sense here, I've heard it said before, that food is such a sensitive topic for the government to get involved in, because it's such a personal topic that telling people what they should or shouldn't eat could be political suicide. What's the story in China? How involved is the government in influencing food trends?
Yeah, I think that's another top subject that we don't usually speak too much about, and it's the role that the government has in dictating or at least influencing the ways in which people live in China. Very recently, a few months ago, the Chinese government published the Healthy China 2030 plan, which includes a massive amount of recommendations in terms of diet and lifestyles. Includes ambitious goals as reducing the consumption of animal protein by 50% between now and 2030. And those are goals that no other government in the planet has set out in such a clear manner. So to the question of who is driving, who is pushing for this shifts to happen, a big part of it is being done by the Chinese government, actually. Now, that is not to say that the execution on the implementation of these changes is going to be done, or that the heavy lifting is going to be done by the government. The ecosystem is actually quite robust in China, where with a strong support of private capital and a large pool of innovators, those government and high-level guidelines get then implemented and carried on by innovators and companies.
You work in this, as we said before, this intersection of food, culture, technology. What are some of the technologies or trends that would really blow people away, a non-Chinese audience away about food consumption or production in China?
Yeah, there's a bunch of them, but recently I've been very interested in one that is quite atypic and quite interesting. China, as most people know, is very well connected. The permeability of technology in people's life is very high. To certain degrees that at times seem to be a little bit unimaginable. One subject that I've been particularly interested about recently is how live streaming and other communication technologies are bridging rural with urban areas. I have seen, we have observed in China over the past few months and past few years, the emergence of a good number of platforms that enable farmers and people in rural communities to communicate and share their life and their products in many cases with urban communities. And that's just one simple example of how a piece of technology that we do have everywhere around the world is being used in a very different way in China. It's being used to create awareness, to make for a better living for rural communities. It is being used for a better transparency to get consumers connected with what they're eating and where their food comes from. So I think China is quite interesting, not so much in creating new technologies, but in taking sort of interesting applications of technologies that are already existing, like that one.
Thank you. We're gonna get some reflections from Emma now. Emma Chow, who's been in the studio very waiting patiently and listening, as we all have, to the insights from China, from Federico. So reflections, Emma. You've been looking at the food system, not just in China, but around the world. Yeah. And how does this stuff land? Is this something that's very different to the global system, or what's the relationship between China and the rest of the world?
Yeah, I've been sitting here nodding my head at a lot of things that you were just talking through, Federico, because one of them for sure, and has always been a big topic of discussion for our team and many other organizations working on food issues, is the topic of meat consumption and proteins, and recognizing in OECD countries, we're seeing beef consumption especially declining as that consumer awareness grows. But then when we look at where these booming populations are in places like China, that's where wealth is accumulating, and it's becoming part of a status symbol. It's becoming part of the everyday culture and diets of eating more beef in particular. So it's a question of, or rather an opportunity of, how can we create food products that are using more diverse protein sources that are making delicious food the default choice for people to diversify the types of proteins they're eating, so that we can help divert from perhaps a trajectory that is not so good in the long term. So that was one of my top reflections.
How are you seeing food through the lens of circular economy?
Yeah, so our first step was really looking at those three underlying principles and saying, if we apply these to the food system, what does that mean? And we realized there are three key areas to investigate and where we can apply these principles. The first one being how we're growing food, and Federico was also alluding to that, of connecting the farmers and looking at the food production side of things. And how do we not only grow food that's healthy for everyone, but food that's grown in a way that's also healthy for everyone. And often we are unaware as end consumers of the pollution, the air pollution, the water pollution, the pesticide exposure, all of these negative health consequences that are happening as a result of the way that we're producing our food. So that's one area that we've been looking at and saying, how can we do it in a way that's regenerative for natural systems? The great thing about working with food is we're working with nature, and nature inherently gets back to its equilibrium. It's regenerative, it's resilient to shocks, and saying, how can we work with the system rather than the more industrial, linear practices that are often being used.
So I get what you're saying there, that because a lot of these things are animals and plants, they grow, they live for a while, they might produce some sort of fruit, but then they die, and there's no waste. It's a natural system, as you say. But that concept is a long way removed from the industrial farming methods or the really large scale farming methods that we need to produce food to feed a global population. There seems a huge gulf in that, and I guess what I'm getting at there is how easy is it, or can we really believe that we can kind of turn the ship around? We've got this farming system now that as you describe, it's destructive and extractive. That sounds like a pretty difficult beast to turn to something better.
Yeah, it is. It is a tough challenge, and
Where do you start then?
Well, going back to the animal production too, when you think that about 70% of all cropland is used to grow animal feed, that's such a big chunk in itself. And so then you think about the innovations and the new ways of producing proteins that don't necessarily need all that land to produce all of that food. And so that is a way that we can plug in some of the innovations to overcome some of these big challenges. And when you also think about what's the alternative, yes, we need to feed this booming global population, but if we continue down the path that we're headed right now and with these industrial systems, we're going to degrade our soil so much so that we won't be able to feed anyone either.
Someone said, does it mean that we all need to become vegan or vegetarian? You must get this question a lot.
Does not mean we need to do that at all. What's really interesting is with livestock raising too, it can be done in a way that's also part of a regenerative, healthy ecosystem. For instance, managed grazing. So if you think about raising some cows, you have some nice green fields. Well, what some farmers will do, and this is what's called managed grazing, is you actually move the cows around to different plots, and they chew down the grass to the point that's actually in its prime growth stage. And because you're moving it around, the grass is sequestering, pulling down carbon from the atmosphere. So it can actually be a net sink rather than a source of carbon. So when you're doing it in a smart, integrated fashion, raising livestock can actually be a really good thing. And therefore, you can also be eating the meat from those cows or livestock that you're raising.
So it might not be the end of the carnivorous human.
Yeah.
We're out of time here at the DIF today, looking at the subject of the Chinese food system, what it could mean for the way that we choose and consume food around the world. But thank you to both of the fantastic guests here in the DIF studio, and thank you to you for joining us online. Tune in next week. We'll be back with a whole new week of amazing DIF content, loads more in store. This is just the end of week one, so make sure you stay tuned for everything else we've got coming up throughout this year's online Festival of Ideas. Thank you very much. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next time.